Elden Ring is overrated. Okay, now before I get a bunch of hate comments saying, how dare you say that my goated game is overrated, well, let me clarify this. I do think the game's pretty good. I have 100%ed the game on Steam, which means I've gotten 34 out of 34 achievements. And let me tell you this, I would never get 100% of achievements on a game I hate. That being said, the general consensus of Elden Ring is, it's pretty great. It's one of the best games of all time. And, it's flawless, masterpiece, blah, 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 right? Well, as I just said, I think it's pretty good, but I don't think it's there. Basically, the main problem with Elden Ring is actually the open world. It actually negatively impacts the game in many ways, and in my opinion, a linear game actually would have made the game way better. Which is not something I would ever think I hear, considering a lot of times linear games suck. But this is my opinion, and the whole review is basically going to be explaining why I think the open world is kind of the problem with this game. In my opinion, okay? That's what I should say. Anyways, let's start talking about the world, okay? Now, the world is amazing. It's actually really good. And you might think, well, that's weird to say when you just said it was a huge factor into why you think the game is problematic. We'll go into that. So, let me start off by the positives. First off, I like how there's a lot of different ways to approach things. What I mean by that is there is so many different things to do in different orders, and you have so much freedom because there's no hand-holding. A lot of open worlds like this will tend to have quests markers or objectives markers that just tell you where to go, and then you do it and you're, I got this item. This game does not do that, which is great because it means that someone could immediately start going for the first boss, and some people could, struggle to the first boss a ton because they immediately went straight towards it, and other people could find a way to just completely skip the entire Stormveil Castle with a teleport feature that is in Khaled, I believe. And so everyone's playthroughs will be different and unique, which I think is cool. Everyone has a different story to tell about how they experience the game, which I think is really actually a huge positive. It also means, replaying the game in theory would actually be very exciting because there's lots of, areas to explore and different ways to approach the game every time you play the game. And, the best part is also that even the main parts of the game, like the linear parts of the game, there's usually multiple ways to approach it. For example, the Grand Lift of Dactus, which is major part of the game, which will take you to the royal capital, so you kind of have to go there. There's actually 3 different ways to approach getting through the Grand Lift of Dactus, and I don't even think most people would know that, but there's a way to completely go around it. There's 2 ways to get to it. I just think things like that is very cool because, I don't know, it's always satisfying to, find new ways to explore. It makes exploration a lot more exciting, because you could find a secret path that no one knows of. That's cool. But I will mention that while the world is open is genuinely a good thing, it's also a huge negative, and we'll go into why that is a thing later. Also, I should mention that the world does become a lot more linear in the end game, which I know I said earlier in the beginning, I wish this game was linear. But, when the game gets linear in this game, it just feels stupid. Because in the end game, it's literally just go to an area and then fight all the bosses and it's over. There's not really much else to do. It's like you go to the snowy top mountains and one other thing to do in the game, and that's it. It's just linear from there, which it's kind of bland. Another good thing about the world is that it's alive, and it makes it a lot more immersive. I found that if you literally go down any major path, you will almost always find some sort of patrols, like knights or skeletons or whatever, right? Like orcs. I think that's just a cool detail because it makes the world feel more alive in the sense of hey, there's actually things using the paths that are made. It's not like there's just paths there that are just abandoned. And you also find encampments and whatnot, and I just think it's a nice touch. Even you find knights riding horses, right? That's great. You can also find animals and beasts like wolves and bears. And, my favorite part of the game is honestly just how much detail they put into some of the places. Noticing that, there's literally food prepped on tables in, castles is just so shocking to me. Like, that's just like a next level of detail. Why would you like ever do that? Like, there's no reason to prep food on a stupid table in a random castle when there's like a bunch of forts and castles in the game already. But it definitely adds to the immersion, which I think is a great thing, because I want to be immersed in a game. That's very important, especially in a single player game. The world is also very beautiful and very full of color. Why do I say full of color? It's because one of my problems with some of the other games, like Dark Souls 3, for example, I have not beat Dark Souls 3, but, you know, from my experience of it, is that there's very bland color, and yes, it's Dark Souls, so obviously, oh, dark, dark, dark. Elden Ring is very vibrant, and it makes the world feel a lot more interesting, in my opinion. Something about dull environments is boring. I mean, even, like, the castles feel unique. Also seeing that massive tree, I think it is, or massive tree, I don't really know what it is, like the yellow massive tree, and it's always in the background, is actually really cool. Because it adds like an extra source of light everywhere you're walking. Also, I should mention some of the beautiful moments, just to share them, would be like when you first exit out of Stormvale Castle, and you see the whole Lake of Lernia for the first time. That is probably one of my favorite views, and I will probably remember that for a long time. That was like a huge shock, because you're just like, wow. Or, you know, when you get to the Snowy Peak Mountains for the first time, and you just see like a bunch of mountaintops in the distance with snow. It's like, oh wow, that's great. Or, you know, my favorite example is the Royal Capital. It's just like this massive city. And you're just like, oh my god. On a first playthrough, exploring the world is probably one of the best parts of this game. The reason why I say this is because a lot of modern day open world games love to just give you the map. And on top of that, they love to give points of interest marked already. This game does not give you a map. It literally gives you nothing in the beginning of the game. You have to fill it all by yourself. But not the normal way, but rather through map fragments that are scattered throughout the land, which means the game determines how much of the map you will see. And that means that you'll never actually have any idea of how much of the map there really is left. And I love this because exploration always feels so interesting in the first playthrough. Unfortunately, this is just kind of doesn't apply after the first playthrough, because you most likely found everything. Also, sorry for my chair squeaking, whatever is cracking. It just does that nowadays, I don't know why, not relevant. And on top of that, I should mention that the map, like I said earlier, it doesn't really hold your hand. This game doesn't. The only thing it really does is it gives a general, like, I guess, arrow kind of thing that points towards a very important site of grace, which is like, you know, hey, this is where you should be going, but, you know, it doesn't always point you in the exact direction, rather just, you know, general idea. And, you know, most people probably won't even notice it unless they're like really lost on like, oh, where do I find the main boss? But, you know, you never actually need to fight the main boss immediately, so I think that's nice. It's a nice touch. There's literally no hand-holding. But, you know, it's a nice thing in the sense that it can be very annoying to play modern games and just constantly get quest markers. Like, I want to explore myself, you know? Explore the stupid, like, a castle by myself and not know while I'm looking at, like, what I'm there for, you know? It's just like, I'm exploring for the sake of exploring. It's a lot more fun. Another thing that's good about the world is that the areas, the different sections in the map are diverse. And they're definitely different. Like, every single area is very unique, and I think the best part of it is that you definitely know when you're entering a new area, which is always a good thing. The only issue with this is that they do reuse a lot of enemies. So, for example, Khaled, one of the most unique areas in the game, which is basically hell, has these decaying like creatures, right? And these decaying creatures can be found, if I recall correctly, I'm pretty sure I've seen them before, in the snowy mountaintops. Which, you know, makes sense. Snowy mountaintops is, you know, very, very cold. Are we really having decaying creatures there? Like, I don't know, that just seems really silly. And, you know, you also have your standard knights that are just scattered all over the place. You know, which can be very annoying when exploring, just seeing the same olds. and reused enemies, but at the same time, when the map is this big of a scale as it is, there's no reason to expect developers to actually be able to make a ton of unique enemies for every single place. So I kind of understand it, but sometimes it's, you know, kind of stupid. One of my major issues with the open world concept is the whole idea of the open world is that, you know, you go explore and you're gonna find loot, right? That's the whole idea. Like, you're exploring. Well, sometimes people explore for fun, but you're usually doing it for loot or, you know, fun little mini balls, whatnot. The problem is in this game is that loot is kind of not great. It's actually a huge issue because there is not much great loot to find on the ground, at least. I mean, chests, that's different, but it seems like most of the times if you go out of way to pick up an item, you usually get trash. It's gotten to the point where it's like, I don't even want to pick up stuff on the ground because why? The best things you can get are 2 items. You know, you can get rune shards and smithing stones. And from my experience, I mean, even these items you most likely won't need if you have a rune farm. Which, yes, I think rune farms are fine, and yes, some people probably complain that rune farms break the game. My thing is that no matter what they do to try to fix this issue of rune farms, there's always going to be one. So it's like, you know, it's inevitable in this type of game where there's just a lot of different enemies. You know, rune farms are going to be made. Like, that's just how it goes. So, I mean, it makes sense. So I don't have a problem with it. But the problem with that is that, you know, even if you don't have a rune farm, like, you literally can just, all the loot you can get can be replaced with ruins. That's literally all I can say. And you can argue smithing stones, some of them you can't buy, but, like, besides that, like, there's rune shards, you can just farm ruins, and, you know, most smithing stones, the lower level ones at least, you can buy, so it's like, yeah, not really too much of a reason to loot besides, like, the high-end smithing stones. And everything else is literally just random crap that I have no clue what it does. For example, like smoldering butterflies, octopus ovaries, blah 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 blah. Which, by the way, if you don't know, that's actually used for crafting, which I've never used once, and I'm pretty sure most people didn't even know existed. So I have no clue what it does. And another thing about the open world is the side content in this game is kind of a hit or miss. Which is kind of unfortunate because a big factor of this game with exploration is you go out of your way to explore and you're going to find a lot of side content. And, you know, some of the side content, like I said, is good in the sense of, like, Ronnie's castle, which is in the Lake of Lernia, is pretty cool. Like, you know, you go there, it's like a mini castle, and then you go there to Ronnie's tower and you find her, and there's a full-on side quest there. Like, oh, that's pretty cool, you know? And, you know, the academy in the Lake of Lernia also is good, you know? You got unique mini-bosses there. Well, not mini-bosses, main bosses. Well, you got unique bosses there, and you got some cool, like, mage guys fighting you. I mean, it's a pretty cool place. The only problem with the academy, by the way, is, I should mention this, is I do think the key is quite hard to find to get in. The reason why I say this is because I do feel like sometimes, you know, like I said earlier, that the game not holding your hand can be an issue, and this is one of those times where it's like, most people are not going to know to go to a random rock formation where a dragon is to find a key, and they're just going to not be able to get in the academy, which is actually a huge issue for later. That's another thing we'll talk about later. Anyways, the side content in this game really comes in the forms of dungeons and catacombs. The best way to describe these dungeons or catacombs is basically Skyrim. If you know anything about Skyrim, you know that dungeons and catacombs in that game are very bland. And Elden Ring does the exact same thing. Now, you know, with the amount of dungeon and catacombs there are in Elden Ring, it's actually absurd. So you can't expect them to, you know, make unique ones for every single one, but a lot of them, if not all of them, feel the same. It's 2 different presets, basically. It's either it's a, you know, cave, underground exploration, or it's, you know, just catacombs. The normal default one, basically, where it's like got some graves on the side of the walls, blah blah blah. So basically, it either has skeleton miners or it has those goblins. That's basically how it is. And there are some puzzles, but the puzzles usually are pretty easy and not really puzzles, in my opinion. And the worst part is, with the catacombs and dungeons, is the mini bosses are reused. In other words, the mini bosses you find are not always reused, but they're usually reused bosses you'll find somewhere else, or just enemies that are buffed up. Like, I don't understand that one, but okay. And the worst part is some of these bosses they use are just out of place. The greatest example of this, and the biggest bone I have to pick, is Mog. Now, if you know anything about Mog, you know that he's the Lord of Blood, so he belongs in the Blood Palace, right? That makes sense. And that's where you find him. But you could also find him in a random catacomb dungeon. You can also find him in a random dungeon under the sewers, under the royal capital. Why is the Lord of Blood in a random dungeon under a sewer? Explain that to me. I wouldn't complain too much about this, except this is a very severe case, because it's like, there is no reason. You could have just put a random, like, knight and buffed him. I would not have complained. But this is just actually stupid. It just feels so out of place, and plus he's a really major boss fight. Well, not major, but, like, he's pretty notable. And so, putting him here is just stupid. And, you know, the worst part about these dungeons and the side content, which, by the way, Dungeons Catacombs, if you didn't know, is a lot of the side content in this game. The worst part about these is that they usually have lackluster loot. Now, sometimes they have good loot, and it's not usually the case. And usually it's just something you never will touch again. You go through an whole entire, dungeon, you clear it out, and you kill the boss, and what do you get? Oh, wow, some random, like, summon that you'll probably never use, or a random weapon that is not great. And even if it is great, the worst part is that you probably can't switch to it because it probably requires different attributes, which I'm about to talk about. Which actually brings me straight into weapons. Weapons in this game are great, right? In theory. There's a ton of different weapons, a ton of different swords. Each sword has its unique Ash of War, which is basically like a special ability you can use. And that makes every weapon cool and unique. Even the bad ones can be somewhat decent, right? The worst part of this is, though, is that it's so inconvenient to switch to any new weapon that it actually makes it so that you don't. And so all this opportunity, from my experience, is non-existent because why switch weapons? Let me explain why this is a thing. Basically, weapons in this game require certain stats to be leveled up in order to get its full potential out of that weapon. So basically, attribute scaling means if something will have a rating in a certain stat, and that if the rating is really high, that means that stat needs to be leveled up a ton in order to get the most effectiveness out of that weapon. For example, strength. There's some weapons that have high attribute scaling in strength and some with dexterity. And then there's others with dexterity and faith. Or, there's a bunch of different combinations. The problem with this is that a lot of the times when you try to switch over to new weapons, you have to rebirth your character in order to use that weapon because you probably don't have the stats that you would need to make that weapon as good as it can be. And the worst part of this is that, well, the weapon could be complete garbage. And also I should mention that the rebirths in this game are limited, and the way you do them is by collecting lava tears, which I believe there's like 14 of them in a world in one playthrough. So in theory you only have 14 rebirths. And on top of that, you have to defeat a side boss, and like I said earlier, it's in the academy. So remember what I said about the academy, how the key is kind of obscure to get to? So that means that some people might not even realize you can rebirth at all, and that's kind of outrageous. Lava tears, you do get a few of them, if you just play the game normally, but I feel like a lot of them kind of just have to go out of your way for them. The point is rebirthing is just annoying. And like I said, you could build your stats around a weapon and test it and find out it's trash. The worst part is if you really want to see a weapon is good, you have to also invest all your smithing stones. So you have to max out that weapon. And that's just so annoying because unless you research it, you're never going to know if a weapon's actually truly good until you already, invested into it. And from my experience, when I invest into weapons, they're way worse than the weapon I'm using. So the best method really is to just find an OP weapon and stick to it. That's literally the best method. And that's stupid. The game basically makes it inconvenient to actually use the options you have. And also, I know some people might say, oh, just level up your character to have all your stats to be good. Well, that's going to take forever, and honestly, I would never do that for just so I can use all the weapons in the game, because that's just that's so much grinding for a bunch of mediocre weapons, let's be honest. Also should mention the whole smithing stone thing is brutal. Because, unlike rebirthing, smithing stones are also limited, but, the higher tier smithing stones are really not easy to come by. And so a lot of times, if you invest all your smithing stones into a weapon, you might be screwed. Or you might feel, like you have to use it even though it's not great. I should mention, OP weapons in this game do exist. Now, a lot of people complain, oh, there's too much OP gear that break the game, quote unquote. My take on it is they can't balance the game perfectly. It's hard to do that because one, you have to account for what attributes people level up and what point in the game they are, which is just so hard to account for. And two, every game is going to have OP stuff. That's just how it goes. Okay, it's just stupid to make people argue about this. Also, if you think a weapon makes the game too easy, don't use it. That's just as simple as it get. I don't understand these people who are like, oh, you use this weapon, you suck, because it takes no skill. From my experience, there's no weapon that outright takes no skill. Everything takes some skill. A lot of things will make the game easier. For example, Blasphemous Blade, which I ended up using in one of my playthroughs, is so easy to use that it's actually almost borderline skillless, but it does take some skill still. So anyways, the point is there are OP weapons in this game, but I don't think they ruin the game completely. You still have to be somewhat decent at the game to use them, and if you don't like it, don't use it. Okay. Another thing I should mention, besides just weapons, is summons. Okay, now this is a rough topic to cover because I'm going to be honest, I think most people agree when I say this, summons in this game feel like they're not balanced around the idea of a boss fight. Not all summons necessarily, but a lot of them. From my experience, especially in every stage of the game actually, is that if you are in a tough situation or you're in the hard part of a boss fight, you can just pull out your summons and suddenly that part of the boss fight will become easy temporarily to permanently, depending on what summon you use. Greatest example of the way too OP summon is the Mimic Tier. You knew I was going to talk about this. I hate saying it, but it's actually so busted that it actually might ruin the game. Now, yes, the developer uses Mimic Tier, and it's the idea of it, I think, is to provide a crutch. Plus, you have to defeat a side boss that is known for being very difficult to actually even access the Mimic Tier. So, to be fair, not everyone's going to have access to this, but if you do it, it's literally makes almost every single boss become so ridiculously easy that it's not even funny. Plus, the Mimic Tier can take all your armor, it can take all your weapons, it can use Ashes of War, it can use spells, which means you could have completely cheesy build, and the Mimic Tier will use the exact same thing. So, for example, you could have a Blasphemous Blade build with a Faith build, right? So, the idea is you just spam your Ash of War and you send lava shooting out from a distance, and then this is the greatest example of how stupid this is. How the Ash of War on the Blasphemous Blade works is that if you hit the boss when the lava makes contact with the boss, you heal a little bit. So basically, your Mimic Tier could heal for hitting the boss, and on top of that, he could use spells to buff himself, And he could also use a heal spell to heal himself up. Why? Why is that a feature? Like seriously. And like even other Ashes of War and other weapons can just be busted. Like there's an Ash of War I think on the Golden Halberd that does like 50% damage reduction. Like this is outrageous because the Mimic Tier basically is just a free tank that dodges and does everything you can do except slightly worse depending on how good you are at the game. That's outrageous. It's basically having another player. It's just stupid. Anyways, another issue with weapons in this game, by the way, is it seems like there's a problem where you can pick up weapons more than once. Now this is very noticeable in New Game Pluses, where you might accidentally pick up a weapon, or not even, maybe you just do it on purpose, who knows, and realize very quickly, why do I have 7 daggers? Now I know what people are going to say, oh, you have a chest, you can, store in there. Why is this a feature though? Why allow the player to have repeat weapons and just store them in your inventory? I don't understand what that gains at all. To me, it doesn't make sense because Sekiro, a game made 3 years prior to this game being released by the same company in New Game Plus, did not allow you to get repeat items. For example, you could not grab 3 mortal blades, you just have 1. So why is it that this game doesn't do that? It just doesn't make sense, and it clutters the inventory. The amount of daggers I have is stupid. Next thing I want to talk about is leveling. Now this is important to talk about because, this is what most players will go to if they struggle to a boss. Or they feel like they're underpowered in an area. They'll go, oh, well, I'm too low level, and so they will level up. The first thing I'll say this is that most of the time, you are not underleveled. That's just how it goes. From my experience, you're almost always overleveled, except for like the early game when you're in Stormvale Castle, and that's about it. Like almost every other experience part of the game, you're almost always overleveled, and you might not even realize it, but you definitely are. It's just how it goes because levels come easy, and the reason why for that, by the way, is because, once the world opens up more and you start exploring a lot of it, it's just ruins come to you naturally. It's just how it works. Another issue I have is soft caps. Now, if you don't know what a soft cap is, it's basically where when you level up a stat, it goes from increasing every time, for example, like going to like, I don't know, let's just say as theoretical, like level 5 to level 6 in health, you gain 10, and then the next level 6 you gain 12. But then level 7 is soft cap, and now you gain 10. So it's basically like a graph where it's like it's going up every level and like increasing the stat more and more, and then it plummets down. Now, there's 2 soft caps on every single level. Level 40 and level 60. Now level 40, it's not a big deal. Level 60 on the other hand is outrageous on how dirty they do you. Now I kind of understand this, by the way, I should mention. Because obviously, you don't want people to just become stupidly OP. But then again, why do this? Basically, at level 60, the stats you gain from leveling after level 60 in almost every skill is so bad that it's actually I'd almost recommend don't even bother leveling past 60 at all. Unless you're in endgame and you have every stat level 60. It's just that bad. For example, health and endurance come to mind, okay? And endurance is a huge issue. So most people level endurance for 2 reasons. Either A, they want more equip load, or B, they just want more stamina. Now when I leveled up my endurance, I wanted more stamina. Well, guess what? Past level 60, you gain no stamina for 3 levels in a row, and then you gain 1 the next level. And that repeats for all the rest of the levels. So basically, for every 10 levels, you gain 2 stamina. That is stupid. And the worst part about this, to me, is that you will never notice. Most players will not notice because they most likely see something increasing. Because, the game has like a blue marker icon on what's leveling up. And they'll see something increasing and they won't think, Let me check how much it's actually increasing by. And so you will be leveling up things and not realize it's inefficient. Health is another example. It's just outrageous. Like, the numbers get so low that it's actually almost stupid to level up health because it's so minuscule. I mean, it goes down to like 1 and 3. Like, really? Why would I want 1 health per level or 3 health per level? What does that help me in any way? I'm still gonna get like basically 1 shot if I'm getting 1 shot, or 2 shot if I'm getting 2 shot. Like, it's not gonna fix the problem. I think the issue with soft caps is that you will never know about them. The only reason why I knew about them is because I was streaming the game and people told me. But if no one told me, I would have just leveled up to level 99. You know, the max level for skill, and thought, oh, I'm so good. No. Again, I understand why this is in the game, I should mention, because the reason why this is in the game is basically to make it so that you're spending a lot of runes and it's dragging out how much you gain. I mean, because most people think, oh, so the solution is to just reduce the amount of levels are for max and then just put, you know, the stat increases in less levels, but it's the same amount. But that doesn't work because then it would be too easy to just gain more stats. It's hard. I'm not describing this well. The point is, best solution in my opinion would be to not have such a major soft cap and instead make it so that you have to pay more the higher level you get, or maybe like you have to pay more runes if you hit a soft cap, but like don't drastically reduce like the amount you gain per level. That's personally how I'd handle it. Okay, anyways, this is starting to become a long video and I didn't really want it to become this long, but you know, we're getting to the longest part of this video. The bosses. And the first thing I'll say right now is that bosses are the weakest point in this game. If the bosses were great, I would not complain. There are people who say the bosses are great, and I don't understand it. I don't. Because it's going to be a little hard to say, but I don't think there's any bosses in this game that actually are just phenomenal. There are pretty decent to great bosses, but there's none that I'm like, oh my god, I have to fight this. Because it's that good. That's a bad sign, because a big part of this game is the boss fights. I mean, the reason why most players are going to be exploring and going into the open world is because they want to fight the bosses. Now, that is an opinion, but I'm going to talk about the flaws with the bosses. Anyways, first off, I'm going to say this. Cinematically, the bosses in this game are insane. Like, the cutscenes are so great. The way they introduce bosses, the way they introduce phases, there's just something about it that's just so good. I don't even know how to explain it really, but like they just do a great job at like showing that like this guy's a god and he's meaning business. Now you could argue sometimes that like in those cutscenes you would realize, hey, wow, these bosses are just standing around waiting. You know, like for example, Godric is just kind of like in the middle of a random like area and then he starts talking like he's been waiting for you, and it's like, okay, that's kind of weird. But you know, that doesn't bring down the experience that much at all, in my opinion. Like seriously, the cinematics are so great that it's just like I don't know how to explain it. It's just so fantastic. If this was in every single game I fought with bosses, I think that I would be the happiest man alive. I'm exaggerating. One of the issues with the bosses, though, is definitely the combat. I think this is a huge factor because the combat in this game uses, you know, a formula that we probably all know, which is the dodge roll technique combat style, where you basically poke and dodge. This style of combat is, in my opinion, it's good, but it's outdated. It definitely could be improved upon. For example, I think Black Myth Wukong has improved upon this a significant amount. And even though it's a small change, I think that it did a great job, and that change would be perfect dodging. For example, Sekiro is so great in combat because of the whole parry system, where it's like it rewards the player for perfectly timing their parry or their block. So when a sword hits your sword, it's perfect. You know, that's a really good way. Like, that feels satisfying, and you have to do it all the time. You know, in Black Myth Wukong, with the same dodging system, basically, it's If you dodge perfectly, time slows down for a small period of time, and you don't lose stamina. That's satisfying. It also makes a nice noise. This game does not reward you for perfectly dodging at all. There's no like perfect aspect, and I think that's a huge problem, especially with bosses, because I want to feel like I did something perfect and be able to do it consistently. It sounds silly, but like just dodge rolling is very bland. You need to spice it up. This has been a thing that's been in games for years. The Elden Ring is made in the 21st century. Okay, well, Elden Ring was made in the 2020s. We can move on from, the old ways, right? My main problem with the combat and a lot of the boss fights is it's literally just dodge, poke, dodge a bunch of attacks, poke, and then, that's basically it. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's not true. And you're right, actually, because there's another strategy. Dodge and poke and punish. Now this is a little more fun. It took me a while to get used to it, but some bosses, well, most bosses, can be punished. A great example of this is Margaret? I don't remember the first boss's name. How do I not know this? I should know this. Margaret? No. Why in my script I spell Margaret? You know what, whatever. Basically, this boss is a great example of a boss you can punish. And how you do this is when he leaps towards you, when he's far away from you, you can just run behind them when he leaps and then hit him from behind. There's a bunch of other examples. I'm not going to go into details. And this does make bosses more interesting because you have to find moves that like you can hit them a ton so that it doesn't just become I'm going to dodge a bunch of moves in a row and then hit them once or twice and then dodge a bunch of moves in a row. And, that's good. It's still not great. A lot of people complain about this game, but the bosses usually will complain, though, by the way, about the fact that most bosses are just dodge fests. I mean, I agree, but like I said, the whole punish thing is a thing, so yeah, and also should mention the parry thing is a thing, where you can parry with the shield, but not all bosses do it, and honestly, I never bothered doing it, but I'm sure it's great. I just didn't bother doing it. Another issue is bosses in this game tend to not feel balanced around what the player has or could do. This is kind of just a thing of more of a... Most players are just over-leveled. That's just how it goes. Or do they just have too much gear? Because the open world is so open that people are going to have so many different things what the developers expected that they can't account for it, because if they did, then the average player who just follows the markers on the map and goes to, the important sites of grace will just get destroyed and ravaged, right? So they kind of have to do, well, like, maybe they have to account for, like, a normal player who just, go to every major boss and that's about it. Like, I feel like how they balance bosses, I'm not sure. But, it does mean that if you explore the world, you basically are at an advantage automatically. And there's not really much you can change about it. And my last really major issue, which is the main theme I'm going to talk about, is there is no reason to get good in this game. I'm going to say it because this is what happened to me on my first playthrough, and I'm sure it happened to a lot of other players. Is that you relied on other mechanics besides skill and ended up beating the game, and the game feels eh. Now, I will say this, Yes, I abused a lot of items and different things like that in my first playthrough, and I tried my best to not do as much of that as I played in multiple playthroughs. So I have gotten better at the game, which has improved my experience by a lot, because when I beat the game on my first playthrough, I felt very just didn't feel like I earned it. I think the thing about it is that while getting good is very frustrating and time consuming, especially because some of these bosses are just brutal if you fall for the trap that they give you, which I'll go over later. Getting good is why linear games in particular made from FromSoftware work so well, because the linear games they make usually force the player to get good. There's no other option. And it means once you overcome a boss, it's like the best thing that's ever happened. And the problem is when you have an open world, it's just, you never actually have a reason to sit there and actually try to learn the moveset. You could always find some other way to just get better in the sense of getting OP or, getting better gear, whatnot. And so there's never an experience where you actually need to sit there and learn the boss patterns and actually get better in that sense. That's a problem, because it leads to a bland experience. Anyways, let's talk about how this happens, because yeah, it obviously happens because of the open world, but it also happens because of unintended features, I believe, at least, that people don't really talk about ever. So let's start with Margaret the Fallen Omen. Oh, it's Margaret. Wait, is it? God, I wrote Margaret. Like, I don't know what it's called anymore. The script is trash. Anyways, Margaret the Fallen Omen. Yeah, it's Margaret. Is the first major boss for most players, assuming you don't just find the way to skip past Stormveil Castle. But most people won't do that. And the whole point of this boss is, in my opinion, is like, hey, it's a starter boss. It teaches the mechanics. And if you want to get good at this game and actually have a good experience, you need to get good at this boss. Because the boss is actually, surprisingly, is really very tame compared to what's going to come up next. And a lot of bosses work upon what the movesets of this boss, basically. And, that might sound surprising, especially for a lot of new players who just get whooped because, that's just how it works. And so for someone like me, I got annoyed that I kept dying to it. And so eventually, I actually found out I could summon a cooperator. Yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about. Because this is one of the examples of how you can just get by cheating a boss with game mechanics. Now, if you don't know, cooperators are usually found in a lot of the major boss fights, where if you talk to certain NPCs in the world, then you can summon them at a boss fight. And basically what it does is it gives the boss 2 times more health, but you have someone to help you fight the boss that can tank a ton of hits and does mediocre damage. In other words, you basically can just backstab the boss the whole time. And, well, for first boss, this is brutal because the NPC you have to talk to is the first NPC you'll most likely see in the game. Like, the moment you enter Limgrave, you're going to probably talk to it. That's ridiculous. It's actually outrageous. Now, I know this is probably not true for most players, but what I did is I ended up actually relying on this cooperator, and instead of actually understanding the game mechanics or any of that, I ended up basically cheesing the fight. Now, I wouldn't define it as cheese because it's an intended game mechanic, and it's, not supposed to be that way, but let's be honest, I mean, cooperators, like I said, will make the fight a joke, so... and also I should mention with Margaret is that most people won't be over leveled because most people won't explore the whole world at this point, or the world that there is at this point in the game. So most people will not have like the whole oh, I'm over leveled. This is one of the very few examples where you won't be over leveled. Anyways, the next boss is Godric, and this boss brought me Mother Troubles. Golly, I was trying to say problems and I switched to troubles. That was weird. Basically, he takes what Margaret's Fallen Omen's, moveset and basically adds more combos and, adds some elemental attacks with some fire breath attacks and some wind attacks. Nothing crazy. I actually think this boss fight's pretty solid. The problem with this is that, if you are not good at Margaret, you're definitely going to have a horrible time with this. So for me, this boss fight was way harder than it needed to be, because I literally had no clue how to really dodge attacks yet. This boss ended up destroying me so much to the point where I was getting very, very frustrated with this. So I actually, was starting to look for ways to cheese it because I was like, oh, this game's ridiculous. Right? And that makes sense because Margaret was supposed to be like the way, the stepping stone to this, right? I don't know if I use that term right. Well, you know what? You could summon a cooperator in this fight. Now, the reason why cooperators in these early game fights are problematic is because there's really no OP summons or OP weapons you can get. You most likely won't be over leveled. So, the point is that cooperators are basically the early game, get out of jail free card. And, the way you get the cooperator in Mark Godric, by the way, is kind of more obscure in the sense that it's an NPC found in the Stormvale Castle. It's kind of hidden, in my opinion. And so, yeah, but, you know, the only good thing about these cooperators, by the way, is most people won't know about them. But if you do know about them, it makes bosses a joke. And also does reward players for actually going on their way to explore, which I think is a good thing. You know, if you have a huge world, you might as well make it an incentive to explore it. Anyways, the point is that I easily beat Godric when I summon this idiot. And so the problem is that the first two major boss fights of the game, which are meant to be somewhat easy, and like, you know, teach you the mechanics of the game, I cheesed with cooperators. And the problem with this is that it actually made it so that it was a lot harder for me to actually get good at the game and actually be able to play the game like a normal person in the sense of like being able to dodge attacks. In fact, it got so bad that it took me multiple playthroughs just to learn how to dodge Margaret's attacks and Godric's attacks without using summons. That's outrageous, don't you say? Like, it literally took me to playthrough 3 or 4, I think. That's kind of crazy. Anyways, the next major boss, the Draconic Tree Sentinel, is not really supposed to be a big challenge for most players, but he can be kind of hard in a skill check if you're still not great at the game like me. You know, if you fight him on foot at least, by the way. He's basically a tree sentinel with some extra attacks, and these attacks are not really that bad. My only problem with his attacks really are just his fireball attack, by the way. I do think this attack is actually kind of stupid because every time you try to heal, he just spams it, and you will never be able to dodge it perfectly if you're mid-healing, so that's kind of outrageous. But the point is that this fight would be somewhat hard for most players, I think, if it wasn't for the fact that you could just drive by it with a horse. And so the whole like challenge of this fight goes away instantly because you can just go on a horse, hit it, and run away, and then come back and hit it, and then run away, and there's no challenge. And I guarantee most people did this. Now, I don't know if everyone did this, and I don't want to be, you know, like, oh, but I feel like a lot of people probably did. And this is one of those features that just like, why do this? Why make an easy mode? I think my whole point, what I'm trying to get at so far, is that it seems like no matter what boss you play, all the major bosses have an easy mode. Why? Also, this is the point of the game, by the way, where you probably will be over leveled for like almost every single boss in the game at this point, which is kind of annoying. Anyways, the next boss is Morgott. He's not required, but I want to talk about him because this is the boss that everyone complains about. And the reason why they complain about this boss is because he uses like an insane amount of combos. And I kind of understand that. Like, if you don't, you know, punish him for his moves, he's just gonna continuously combo, and sometimes it feels like there's no room to hit him at all. But, you know, like I said, if you just learn to punish him and find windows to punish him, this boss actually is not that bad at all. The main problem with this boss is that I feel like it's meant to be a skill check. Like, if you could beat this, like, yeah, you're pretty set up. Like, it's pretty good. Problem is, wait for it, you can get a cooperator summon. Also, at this point in the game, you could have the Mimic tier. Oh boy, so you probably can guess what I did is I just used the cooperator and on my first playthrough, I beat this with literally ease because the cooperator turned this boss into a joke. This boss is actually pretty hard, you know, especially on a first playthrough because, you know, you're not going to realize that you can punish his moves, instead just trying to dodge all of them. And if, you know, from what I talked about earlier, you probably would guess that, yeah, I wasn't good at dodging still. So I just relied on outside sources. And of course, this is at the point in the game where, you know, if you do this, you're going to probably say, oh, this game's too easy. Because, you know, when I first beat him in like 2 or 3 attempts, I thought, wow, this game's a joke. Why is this so hard? Oh. Didn't realize I was playing the game on easy mode. Next up is Radahn. Now, I know this is kind of weird timing to put him here, but yeah, I think this is where most people would probably beat him. or attempt him. Now, Radahn is probably one of my favorite bosses in the sense of like cinematically is the best. When I said cinematically a lot of the bosses are good, this is one of the bosses that I actually meant. Because Radahn is just crazy. Basically, he has a Radahn festival in a random castle, and they basically, all these men gather and try to find someone who will lead them into battle against Radahn. This warrior who's like really, really massive, and he's feared because he's stupidly strong and can control like Earth or something. The point is he's really hyped up and is one of these big beasts. And unfortunately, at least from my experience, is I came in and it was a joke. I will say this. The way the boss is cinematically great in the sense of like when you get to the arena, he's shooting these arrows very fast and you're like trying to dodge them, and then you summon in your men that are gonna help you. Which, by the way, these summons kind of suck, so it doesn't make a big difference. And then you go in, you go fight them, and you realize, why do I do so much damage? I don't think everyone's gonna be in this situation, but because Radahn is kind of in this spot where it's like after you hit the Grand Lift of Dectus and use it, right? Most players will be overleveled because, you know, most players have explored so much of the world at that point. There's so much of the world you can explore that you will most likely be overleveled and do way too much damage. Which is sad because this guy would be hard if you actually weren't overleveled. It's just how it goes. And this is the boss that allows you to get the Mimic Tier. Which, like I said earlier, makes the game a joke. And this is where I think problems start to arise. Next boss we're going to talk about is Fire Giant. This boss is the tankiest boss in the game. I think it has the most HP and is the biggest boss. That being said, he's the easiest. I mean, even for me, I'll have to say this. The boss is a joke. It's just true. The boss is just so easy because you can stand behind him on his left leg and hit him constantly, and he really can't punish you for it because the only attacks that can punish you are attacks that you can see miles ahead of time, or miles away, basically. And the only other thing that could catch you off by guard is his rolling, which is not really an issue in my experience. I don't know, this boss is just so easy, it's outrageous. Like, it's just stupid. I mean, if you do approach it any other way, yeah, it becomes hard, but just don't. The next major boss fight there is Malekith, I think is how you pronounce it. And this is one of my favorite bosses. Actually, it is my favorite boss of this game. I'll say it. And that being said, I want to say he's one of my favorite bosses of all time, but it does have some weaknesses that need to be talked about. So we're at the point in the game where bosses become way more drastically difficult for no reason. It goes from like, it's pretty easy to what the hell is happening? Like a huge jump in difficulty. Malekith is a great example of this. His first phase is pretty bland and uninteresting in my opinion and brings the fight down a lot. The second phase is where things get crazy. Now a lot of people hate the second phase because it's too difficult, but my thing is I actually found that yes, I hated his second phase when I first played him because he's very hard to play if you're not good at the game. I'm just going to say, he's a boss that does not allow you to cheese him. You could use Mimic Tier, and he will not really... He will kill your Mimic Tier easily. Like, it's one of those cases. But if you actually learn the boss fight, this is easily my favorite boss fight. It's so satisfying to dodge his attacks. Basically, what he does is he becomes very mobile and acrobatic, and jumps around all over the place. He shoots out, like, projectiles with his sword, and he also can do big explosion attacks. And it's very, very fast paced, which makes the fight a lot more fun because when you have projectiles, you have to dodge at very fast speeds and you perfectly dodge them. It's like, oh, that's pretty fun. That's great. The only issue with this fight, unfortunately, is the reason why I think a lot of people complain. There's a debuff. This debuff drains your health rapidly, and this debuff comes from, I believe, 2 different attacks, both of which are attacks that he Basically, it's like an explosion attack where he plunges his sword in the ground and it explodes. I think. I'm not 100% sure on that one. I know one of them definitely is. The point is that this debuff is horrible. It ruins the fight almost. The reason why I say this is because you end up focusing so much on your health that you actually just don't think about anything else and you die. Because you lose health at such a fast rate that if you don't think about your health, you're gonna die. But then if you focus too much on, trying to heal, find moments to heal, you're also going to miss, obvious attacks that will just destroy you. And that was my experience, is that every time I died, usually it's because I had the debuff, and yeah. But the thing about this fight is this is one of the only fights in the game where I actually think that not the only, but one of the very few fights in this game where there's really no easy way out. In my first playthrough, the first phase was easy, but the second phase where my problems were, and Mimic Tear carried me for most of it, but it does die off, and you kind of have to get lucky, which is what I did. So there's still an easy mode, but it's not really fully easy mode. Alright, anyways, next up we have an optional boss. You knew it was coming. Melania. Melania's the boss that everyone goes to when they think of bad bosses. It's just because she's hard. It's just how it is. And the way they add her difficulty, it feels bullshit. I'll say how it is. And the worst part about this boss fight is actually it's purely optional. You might not even realize that at all, because I didn't realize it in my first playthrough, but it is completely optional. And there is no really phenomenal rewards to get for killing her, besides bragging rights. Let me start off by saying this. First phase, I do think the fight's actually pretty good. It would have been one of my favorite fights of all time. Because the way she attacks very fast, but has a lot of room for punishments, but also punishes you for not being good, it's crazy. And this is the boss that made me get better at the game, because there's no cheesy in the first phase. You could spawn in a Mimic Tear, you could use an OP weapon, but there's a second phase. So you can't just rely on destroying the first phase and thinking, oh, I'll be fine second phase. You're not. Plus, Mimic Tear will get destroyed by this boss. Anyways, the point is this fight is very fast paced. And I love her sword attacks. I just love them all. Every single move is just great. There's lots of room to punish, and she does punish you if you're not paying attention or not understanding the mechanics of her fight. The only unfortunate part of this boss fight is that, well, you know what it is. Waterfall Dance. This move is, it feels like it's in there just because they want to make a fight harder for the sake of making it harder. This fight single-handedly ruins the fight. It just does. The problem with the Waterfall Dance is that it requires nearly perfect dodging every single time, and it's repeated multiple times. Now, on the first phase, maybe once or twice, but in the second phase, it's just quite random. I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is that basically, no matter how you dodge it, you most likely will get hit, because it will almost always reach you. Even if you're across the arena, it will reach you. And the worst part is, when it does reach you, it goes back for seconds. It goes forward 3 times, and then it goes back once. Which is just so brutal and devastating, because it does so much damage. The amount of times I lost fights because of this move is crazy. And to make things worse is that when she hits you or makes contact with you with her sword, she heals. Now, it's not a significant amount, but this adds up very quickly because she's very difficult, obviously. And so you could easily find yourself in a situation where she out-heals the damage you do. I mean, it didn't happen often, but it can definitely happen. Which I think adds icing to the cake, because this boss went from, oh, this is pretty reasonable, to just straight up outrageous. I think healing on its own without the Waterfall Dance would be fair. But with the Waterfall Dance, it just adds too much to the game. And then the second phase is where I personally used Mimic Tear to cheese it. Unfortunately, yeah, the second phase can be cheesed by Mimic Tier, but you do have to actually learn how to get good in the first phase, from my experience with this boss fight. In second phase, I will admit this part of the game is like in second phase the boss gets outrageously annoying. Um, so basically, she spams waterfall dance, and she has moves where she can explode and leave behind particles of Scarlet Rot, which is one of the worst debuffs in the game because it just does so much damage and constant damage once it fills up your bar. And the worst part is, it's so easy to actually get inside the particles, and they last for too long. It's just annoying. Like, you already have an annoying hard boss, and then you add Scarlet Rot on top of that, one of the hardest debuffs to counter. Yeah, that's just annoying. And this is one of the few bosses where I genuinely feel like it was required for me to use Mimic Tier. All the other bosses I use Mimic Tier on, which is basically all of them once I got it, by the way, I never felt like I actually needed it. This boss, I need it. Now, I'll say this. Obviously, no boss needs Mimic Tiers. This game was tested. People have beaten Millennia without like any good gear. I mean, you could look up videos of how people are beating Millennia without any armor, with like a trash weapon and trash stats. Yeah, I get that. That's not me, and I'm just gonna say this, is that that's a stupid argument, a stupid point, because most people are not trying to fight a boss and spend 8, 9, 10 hours on a boss that's optional. That is just made to be difficult for no reason. And the worst part is if you're like me in my first playthrough, you're not even good at the game. So like, you're just in a really bad situation. Okay, anyways, the final boss of the game. Alright, let's talk about it. The final boss of the game is probably the biggest disappointment of all of the bosses, because I was expecting, a great final boss. Also, yes, I skipped Elden Lord because it's not really too relevant. In my opinion, Elden Lord is alright. I hate saying that, but that's just what I think, and I know a lot of people love him. Anyways, not relevant. The problem with the final boss is that it puts two bosses in one. Now, this can work. I've seen it done. Obviously, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is a great example of this, where there's many bosses where, the first phase is a different boss and the second phase is a completely new boss. In this scenario, this does not work. The reason why is because Elden Beast, the final boss, is such a terrible boss in the sense of just everything about him, and that it just brings down the fight completely, and the first phase feels stupid. It feels dragged out. Let me explain. Elden Beast is pretty hard because all he does is run around and shoot projectiles from a distance at you, and it's very easy, from my experience at least, to lose health from random projectiles that you just don't see because the camera angle is bad. Why is the camera angle bad? Because the boss is massive, and it has to account for where it's moving, and like I said, Elden Beast is moving all over the place. Basically, it's just a gigantic dinosaur that can just swim around and move very quickly all over the place, and uses projectiles constantly that you most likely won't be able to see all the time. I don't like this boss. I don't. It just feels so lame to end the Elden Ring on a note of just a beast that moves around all the time where you have to chase it down. And the first boss, a lot of people like. I don't think it's offensive by any means. I think it's alright. But the worst part is it's like every time you fight it, it's like if you get hit, you get instantly frustrated because it's not a hard fight. But like if you lose, health or flask, you realize, well, now Elden Beast is that much harder. I don't know. Elden Beast is like, it's artificially hard in the sense it's always running away from you, so you never can get hits in. That's the issue. I don't know. It's a horrible way to end off the game, and personally, I think Elden Lord would have been a better boss to end the game off of, which is kind of shocking. Also, for easy mode, I'd say, yeah, I mean, this boss fight there's definitely an easy mode. You could just use Mimic Tier in the first phase, which will destroy the first phase, and then, I mean, Elden Beast, it doesn't require too much skill. You just have to understand, to pay attention. I don't know. I'm giving conflicting messages, but because one hand, Elden Beast is hard, on the other hand, it's not that bad. I don't know. Anyways, the point is that in this game, bosses leave a lot left to be desired, and also almost every boss, the major boss, has an easy mode besides the end game. The end game, it just ramps up in difficulty for no reason, to the point where it's actually kind of outrageous for the difficulty spike. But for the most part, the game has easy modes, meaning you don't ever have to get good. And like I said, that could be argued, like, yeah, you have to get somewhat decent, but there's always items you can rely on, or OP weapons you can rely on, that make the game just really easy. And I think the average player will always find a way to, cheese the game or make the game easier, because the average player does not want to spend way too many hours of their life getting good at a boss. There's a reason why not a lot of people play Dark Souls. There's a reason why not a lot of people play Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Because people don't want to spend hours fighting bosses to get good. Including me. But the worst part is when you beat the game, you leave feeling, wow, this is unsatisfying. And when I replayed the game multiple times, I never felt like I was great at the boss fights. I always felt like when I tried to do them without help or support with OP things, I always felt bad. Because it just, I sucked. Yeah, that's never a good feeling. I don't think to be honest, most of the boss fights I still would struggle to if I tried to attempt them now. I think the main issues with the bosses is, like I said, there's an easy mode for them and most people will get them. The open world makes the game easier, by the way, inherently. And I prefer the getting good method. And two, the combat in this game can feel really weird, and some of the bosses use very cheesy moves against you. Overall, I think bosses are not horrible by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not, fantastic. And that brings the game down somewhat. The last thing I want to talk about fittingly at the end of the video is the endings, because, I got all the endings, or the major endings, and I'm sick of games that do this, where they try to have replayability by having a bunch of different endings. Now, there's really 4 main different endings, and to be honest, they all kind of suck. My main problem with them is that the cutscenes can be underwhelming. I'm one of those people who I don't want to just see a different cutscene but do the same thing over and over, because that just feels really boring. It's like I put all those hours of gameplay just to get a different cutscene. Really? That's usually what happens. I would rather have it so that I have unique boss fights or unique moments in the game, and the only one time that I actually felt an ending was great, or the path to an ending was great, was Ronnie's questline. I don't know if I'm saying the name right, because it was so unique and different. And, the end cutscene was not great. The whole questline itself was honestly pretty good, in the sense that there was so much uniqueness to it, and it made you play the game differently than you normally would. And no other ending did anything like that. It just revolves around, play the game like normal, maybe do one thing differently in your playthrough, for example, talk to, 2 fingers and become evil. That's one of the endings, basically. The point is I wish they added, a new boss. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, has a similar problem, but at least they have one of the endings, they have new boss fights. Completely reworked new boss fights. I think that would have been cool for at least one ending to have new boss fights. I don't know, just doing the same thing over and over is kind of lazy, and it's not replayability. People argue what it is, but I don't think it is. Which brings me to another point. This game is not really that replayable, in my opinion. I don't know if it's just me, but it just, once you've explored the whole world once or twice, it's yeah, you could use a bunch of different variety of weapons. You probably could afford to do that at that point in the time. But you've probably experienced most of the world, so what is there to see? There's always going to be something new to see, obviously. I mean, every playthrough I played, I always found something new that I've never seen before. But it wasn't enough to go oh, this was so worth replaying. I don't know. Just kind of started to drag. Which is not a good sign. If a game was phenomenal, it would not drag when I'm replaying it. Overall, I think this game is pretty solid, and it does have its good moments, especially on a first playthrough. I think it's really, really good. But once you dig deeper and play the game over and over, you start realizing, yeah, this game's not as great as I thought. And yeah, I don't know. If you like this type of review and you want to see more like this, well, good news. I'm probably going to do more of these. And the next one I'm going to do is Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, because I really, really like that game. I have passion for it. I only really want to review games like this type of style, if I really, really enjoy it or really have like a passion for what I'm saying. Like, if I have a hatred for a game, you know, like a passion for it. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.